Hello and welcome to the Welsh History Podcast, episode 126, Sources. So, for those of you on audio podcast version, this will be I'll try and make this very descriptive. For those of you watching via Patreon, because this is a video I put up on Patreon for all those who have donated and supported me for the last few years to view, we're going to talk a little bit about sources and about the books that I have, what I lean on, what are primary sources, what aren't, why sometimes I focus more on one than the other, and what becomes kind of the main book for certain periods, which there definitely are, because sometimes you want a generalized book that you can kind of refer to, or you want a very specific book that you can refer to. So what I've broken them down into is massive piles on my desk and on my chair here, which you can't see, thank goodness, because it's a mess. And I'm going to try and bring them up in order. That might mean some editing on my part just to make sure that this works. But certainly I want to talk about at least portions of each one so you kind of have an idea of what they're about. So first off, and kind of the first book I'll show here, this is one I've shown to the patrons before. It's called The Celtic Heroic Age, which is literary sources for ancient Celtic Europe and early Ireland and Welsh sources. It's basically a collection of written documents that go through from various eras describing the Celtic peoples pre-Roman and Roman. So you have early Greek sources, some of the Roman sources and that kind of thing. So you have all sorts of different descriptions and discussions. There's a lot of Irish stuff. There is some Brittonic and Brittonic Latin sources as well, which is nice, and it does give you sort of origin stuff for the mythology of things like Taliesin and Arthurian legends, as well as stuff from earlier ages kind of talked about. And it's a very good book. It is very much, if you're looking for something that's actually going to be something to follow, it's not really great for that. But if you kind of want some sources to actually read what people were saying in ancient time periods, this is a book that might be of interest to you. Next is The Blood of the Celts. This is a book which I didn't use lots, but it is an interesting book. It's talking about DNA discoveries and genetics about ancient British peoples. It is an interesting book, but it's heavily academic. So at times it can get a bit hard to read, but it's got good source material. It does have photos. And so this book has been something I've used in a couple of the episodes, but it wasn't one that I relied on simply because of that small fact that it's heavily weighted towards specific things. So if you're not interested in that, and it's not very historical, it's useful by far. Next is probably the book I relied on a lot in the early going, mostly because it is large, but also because it actually goes into depth in a number of different things. And it's called Britain Begins, written by Barry Cunliffe. It is an excellent book. I will say, so I should clarify something. This is from Oxford. So to give you an idea, kind of one of the problems I run into here is that sometimes these books aren't accessible to me in Canada easily. The reason for this is price, but also sometimes it just isn't published here. And if you want to get a non-published book, sometimes like on Amazon or on like academic sites, sometimes they can cost hundreds of dollars, which is kind of out of my price range. This one, on the other hand, was £25 retail, or $30 American. It's probably about 40 Canadian, so don't know what it is for everybody in Australia and other places, but that kind of gives you a concept. It is very in-depth. It covers a lot of stuff. Basically, it covers everything from the beginning of Britain right up until the Norman invasion. So it has a lot of cool material, talks a lot of archaeology, leans on that, obviously, for the stuff before the Romans come, because, let's be honest, there's not a lot of information before the Romans come that is actually documented. So from that perspective, it was a book I leaned on heavily just because of that, and I totally recommend it as a book you can read. It is academic in nature. Understand that Professor Cunliffe is not writing this to be a page turner, if you want to use that terminology. It's more about bringing out a lot of different subject matters, and some of it can be skippable without it hurting the overall readability. I actually found it really interesting. If you're into history, especially early British history, this is a book that I kind of feel like it's kind of mandatory. And it definitely gives you a good background without being boring, which not all academic books do that, let's be honest. So I recommend. Anyway, we'll have a few of those. Okay, here's another one. Myths and Legends. This is just a book I picked up because it was cheap. Just has random stuff in it. More Celtic, some Celtic stuff. Didn't really use it wholeheartedly, but it was interesting to kind of look at. You get comparisons to various things. Very colorful book. It was very cheap, like I said. I think I picked it up for $5 on a sale, so yeah, that's why I got it mostly. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the other things that I've used. For this book, I didn't really use loads, but it is kind of interesting to read, also cheap. Brief History of the Druids. There's an entire book series called A Brief History, and it has different topics. If you want to read some things like Vikings and Anglo-Saxons and Normans and certain wars and things, and you don't want to be bogged down with a lot of information, these books are very good because they're generally written by academics, first off. They're versions that are amended from the original academic books they've written, so they're compressed down, so they focus in on specific stuff. They're easy to read generally, and they're small and paperback and cheap, which this one was £9. Like I said, probably picked it up for closer to $5. And I know that most of the ones I found were on sale. So I have loads of them. I have the Anglo-Saxon one. I have one on medieval times and all that kind of stuff. I don't use most of them for this, but they are very fun to read. Right, early British history. You gotta have as a source material Tacitus. I actually have one which is his original history of... yeah, here it is. This is the better one. Sorry. So that one's more of a general history of Rome, so it gives you an idea of what's going on. Not full and complete, and keep in mind Tacitus only lived until the beginning of the 2nd century, so he's not going to have a lot of stuff beyond that. Well, he's not going to have anything beyond that, obviously. And there's holes in what he's written because we don't have it all. This is probably the better representation if you're British. The book is Agricola and Germania, I should say that correctly. The Agricola is a book that he wrote dedicated to his father-in-law. It is a book of his governorship of Britain in a period right after conquest, right after the first real rebellions with Boudica, and it kind of talks a lot about those early days, talks a lot about Welsh tribes like the Ordovice, and those kind of things, so in the Silures. So for me, that's a book that was a mandatory book to read. It was a mandatory book before I even started the Welsh History Podcast. I've read this before then. So it's a great book, gives you a lot of information, primary source material, which is nice, and it is cheap because it's a Penguin book, so you can pick this up relatively inexpensively. I got this for $20 in Canada, probably 15 to 10 depending on where you're getting it at and what currency we're talking about. So Penguin books are great, as long as you're not looking for a lot of links to the sources, because they don't have loads of that. But if you just want a source book, like, say, Suetonius' The 12 Caesars, this is the kind of book you want because it's inexpensive. A lot of university students use it. Generally, they're older books, like they aren't typically written like recently. So there'll be translations, but they might be dated. So if you're looking for the newest translations of things, you might not find it there. But they're still really good. Another kind of mandatory book for early Rome, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, written by Edward Gibbons. This is heavy duty. I don't think this is the complete version. I think this is an edited version because I think it's even longer than this. This is written in the 18th century. Tiny, tiny print in this book. Not very accurate these days, and his thesis was about how Christianity basically destroyed the Roman Empire, which we don't believe anymore, at least not wholly. So it's kind of the gold standard edition of the first real research into Roman history, but it's not as accurate as it once was, and certainly modern research has changed a lot of what we think about the Roman Empire and how it came to its end and the history of it. So, good book if you're looking for sort of an understanding of certain things. Does cover, pretty much the whole thing, but don't trust it as the only source. It's not necessarily a great source material. Plus, old, hard to read for that reason, if nothing else. All right, so now we're moving into post-Roman period, and these books are interesting, some of which I picked up through friends of mine actually being in Britain and able to buy them for me and send them to me, because honestly, I wouldn't have got them otherwise. In some cases, it's books that I picked up via universities. They're not cheap because of that if you're in Canada, not going to lie. And they're very heavily academic, i.e. this is a secondary source book. It is basically presentations written on Beyond Godolphin, Dark Age Scotland in medieval Wales, the proceedings of a day conference held from 19th February 2005. Really interesting book because it gives you a good understanding of where the Old North came from and kind of some of the ideas that then migrated into Wales, because a lot of North Wales mythology, I would argue, comes out of some of the ideas that came here. And of course, Godolphin, that epic poem that was written, some say around the 6th, 7th century, is very significant to our understanding of older Celtic, Welsh, Brythonic, depending on your word usage, storylines and ideas. So from that perspective, it's really important. And of course, all academic writing, so you can trust it as a source, and it gives you places to look for things, which is always nice. So in case you're not fully conversant or you don't really like everything they've said, you can back up what they're saying. Of course, it is very academic, so if you're just sort of like you just want to read a good book, probably not the kind of thing you want, because it's just topics. And it's just random topics because it's a bunch of professors talking on their specific subject matter that they know, and it just happens to be under that banner head. Right. Okay. Now, these are what I call my controversial early Middle Ages books. But one that was very important to me when I first got into Wales, actually, it was one of the first books I read when I was there. I remember reading it, and I remember being absolutely fascinated. And it's called Celt and Saxon, The Struggle for Britain, 410 AD to 937. It's written by Peter Barrowford Ellis, and if you listen to the earlier podcast, you know I've mentioned this a few times. He is a very interesting writer. He is very much pro that the idea of the Celts and the Saxons conflicting was historical, and that the establishment of a lot of what we understand from people like Bede and Gildas is actually historical. And everybody's up in arms about what that is and how true it was and all of that kind of stuff. So keep that all in mind. By the way, using a green screen for those of you on video, so my Welsh shirt I am wearing currently, all the green is gone. It's all black. Okay, here's another book I used a lot, because this one actually is one I've recommended to patrons before. I think it's a very good book for somebody just trying to read a bit about Welsh history without necessarily getting bogged down. Again, it starts from the early Middle Ages, and it goes until the conquest. It's called The Welsh Kings, Warriors, Warlords, and Princes, written by Carrie Mond, who is a professor in Wales. It is a really good book. Again, a Welsh perspective, which is nice. It is far-reaching, but not that big. And paperback, which if you're wanting to buy a lot of books, that's kind of what you want because they're cheap. If you want books that'll last, probably not what you want. So this one here was £13. I think I bought it for about $20 Canadian, somewhere around there. And you can also buy a digital version of it, Kindle. Same thing with Britain Begins. Actually, a lot of it I ended up reading on Kindle because I actually lost the book for a while. And so you can get them on digital copies as well. So I recommend kind of checking it out for that side of it, because sometimes it can be sort of like, it isn't cheaper, I'll tell you that much, but books that you might not be able to get at a good price, you might be able to get at least at paperback price, which I guess is the reason why you want it. All right, so now we're on to some of the books that we'll call speculative, at least this one. Here it is. The Penguin Classic version of Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain. You all know my thoughts on this pseudo-history. It is basically like reading a mythology book, so keep that in mind. A lot of it is not very accurate, so keep that in mind. But it is a book that was incredibly influential on the medieval period. We're talking about Owen Glendower, for example. A lot of the stuff that he professes, a lot of the prophetic nature of the bards at the time, revolve around the ideas that come out of this book. So keep that in mind, that the influence of this book, regardless of its historiography, is massive, and it is something to keep in the back of your mind. It will remain historiography for pretty much the better part of 700 years. It isn't until, I would start to argue, the Victorian period, that there really is an effort to sort of hit back at this storyline. And it won't really change until after World War II, when people start to realize that the evidence is very different from what he's professing it to be. And of course, even in his age, he was called a liar. So it's not like even in his own time he was completely trusted or believed. But as always with these kind of things, once people die, suddenly they become important. Right, so that's that one. Now we're kind of moving into other things, but I just wanted to go back into some Roman things for a second. We have our ancient Rome military and political history. This is not real fascinating stuff, but want to get into it, you can read that. Written by Christopher S. McKay. It's okay. I think he was my professor, if you want to know the honest truth. It tells you what I remember. So, that's that one. Now, this book, I have read a bit. This is a bit of an antithesis to some of the books that I've talked about earlier, especially the pro sort of Welsh and specifically, not pro-Welsh, but pro-Celts and Saxons and that kind of thing. This is written by Guy de la Bourdieu from Time Team fame, if you watch that show at all. Roman Britain and the New History, which is done based on some of the ideas about changes of understanding of how the Romans came and settled and the influence they had on what was here and how much of what we have transferred to there. He does a lot on the Gallic Empire, which I think is really cool, and certainly worth reading for that alone. So I would highly recommend that.
This is Peter.
And this is Tom.
We want to tell you guys a little bit about our podcast. Tom and I met in college, became best friends, and then teachers almost 20 years ago. Sometimes school just does not allow us to elaborate on the topics that we find interesting, like the real shark attacks that inspired the movie Jaws, or the real historical context to Indiana Jones artifacts. Where does cereal come from? Or are zombies real? Does Ben Franklin really deserve to be on a $100 bill? On our podcast, just like in our class, there are no stupid questions.
Just two friends having a lighthearted conversation about history, pop culture, and the context of current events.
Listen to History Teachers Talking Podcast from Evergreen Network, anywhere you get your podcasts.
The Battle of Waterloo was one of the most famous turning points in world history. But what happened next? My name's David Montgomery, and I'm the host of The Siècle, a history podcast that tackles exactly that. Join me as I cover France's overlooked century in between Napoleon and World War I. The Siècle, spelled S-I-E-C-L-E, is part of the Evergreen Podcast Network and can be found wherever you get podcasts.
So another book in the medieval period. Now, I have it somewhere. I don't have it here. Is the Gildas book. I don't know where it's gone at the minute. I do actually have Gildas's writings on basically the ruin of Britain. I don't have it upstairs. I think it's downstairs. So with that in mind, I will say I have that book. If you really want to understand kind of early 6th century British writing, that's the book to go to. It is really the origin story for a lot of how we understand the historiography of Britain at that time. it is not to be taken literally in some cases, because as I've had podcast episodes on this, just the fact that he is preaching to people, he is talking from a religious standpoint, so he's not going to be, someone. And again, he's talking the mythology. I mean, he's where we get Hengist and Horsa and the whole idea that the Saxons came in because of Vortigern. So if you understand that that's something to be taken as sort of within a grain of salt, and you're willing to put up with a lot of biblical referencing of Britain as basically Israel and kind of the abomination of desolation and those kind of things, if you know your Bible, it's very much kind of Jeremiah-esque type writing and very prophetic and very much talking about the destruction of Britain. So, thus the name. So, going back to my medieval Welsh stuff, here's another academic book. This is written by Sean Davis. He's actually really good. Very in-depth, very academic, and very, very much a heavily weighted document, even though it's not very big. And I will be honest with you, it is a bit of a slog to read if you're not into the academic side of it. So keep that in mind. It's called War and Society in Medieval Wales from 633 to 1283. Really good if you want to understand how society was constructed and how warfare was constructed in that period. And but it is very heavy in that, so if you're not into that, it might bore you. I'll be blunt. So keep that in mind. All right, so moving on, we'll talk a little bit about this before we move on to more medieval stuff. One of the listeners actually recommended this to me, and unfortunately these books are really expensive, which is unfortunate because I'd love to have all of them, but they are only sold by the University of Wales, and they run, even they're like £50, so you're talking $100 for one book, and it's only about the Gwent County history. So it's great. It gives you lots of information. In fact, it was this book that explained to me the origin of some of the castles, like not necessarily the castle itself, but why the Normans tore down some of the old Roman buildings, specifically on the fact that it was believed that it kind of represented the old Welsh kingdoms, and so they would tear down the old admin buildings because of that specifically and build a keep on it, more or less to kind of say, hey, we're here. And so this is the Gwent County History, Volume 1, Gwent in Prehistory and Early History, which is, it goes into kind of early Normans domination, but doesn't go much beyond that. It is very much archaeology book, because as we know, there's not a lot of writings in Southeast Wales at this time, so we don't have a lot of examples. That's why if you listen to the early medieval stuff, you're not going to hear a lot about Southeast Wales. Not for lack of trying, but the reality of it is they were conquered early by the Normans, and a lot of their writings and a lot of the history that they had got torn apart, basically. So we just don't have it. Either that or they just didn't have a lot of people writing. That might also be part of the problem. Right, another book to keep in mind in the early medieval period, something again that's a primary source type document. This is not written to be history. This is and my pronunciation is what it is, the Mabinogion. There we go. Ooh, I got it that time. This is a translation by Synod Davies, Oxford World Classic. This is £9 in Britain and about $14 in the United States, probably about $20 in Canada, as that's how it kind of works. This is a English translation of that series of stories. So if you want to talk about early Welsh mythology, it comes out of here, especially early Welsh and sort of post-Brythonic. The records that we have of this book are somewhere around the first copies are like the 11th or 12th century. So they're later medieval written down, or at least the copies that we have, but they're obviously books that came from oral histories and oral storytelling, which had existed long before. And there's a lot of very much kind of ancient ideas, gods, the way they talk, they kind of big them up as Christian saints, but they're obviously gods. Those kind of things, which I think are important to kind of consider when you want to talk about source material. You do need to talk about this book. It is incredibly influential. Again, two medieval writers, and it does have a lot of interesting stuff in it. I used to actually read some of this to my kids because it was kind of cool. So yeah, there's lots of good stories in it. I've read a couple actually on the podcast, but there's so much more in here, and there's a lot of Arthur stuff. So if you're into that, this is a place to go. So when I was relying on sort of the early middle period of, I guess I should say, late Welsh history as far as independence goes, one of the things that I found, and unfortunately the cover has been lost before I found it, is an old book, very old book. This is actually from the 50s, which I found in a used bookstore here in Canada, and it's called An Introductory to the History of Wales, Volume 2, The Middle Ages, Part 1, from 1063 to 1284, by A.H. Williams. I don't know that this book exists anywhere in modern print. It is just a book I found. It's very old as far as the academic side of it is, so if you're looking for something that's a bit more, includes like modern archaeology or modern information, this might not be the book for you for that. Again, because I found it at a used bookstore, it might not be very useful to find, but it was actually really useful for me on a couple of pieces of information. Not a main book. I'm getting to the main book. It's coming up. I will say that the Kings of Wales was definitely one I leaned on because it had a lot of different items in it which are kind of key. So here's one of the books that I relied on in the middle to late Welsh independence. This is called A Struggle for Mastery, which is a Penguin's History of Britain, 1066 to 1284 by David Carpenter. Very, very large book. It flips from Wales, Scotland, Ireland, and England, and it talks about everybody's perspective. So if you're into various perspectives in this period of time, then this is a book for you. Again, written in an academic format with very little tiny writing, but it was very helpful on understanding both sides of the battle, if you want to call it that, and was very helpful as I was trying to understand where we were going in the Middle Ages, specifically towards the end of independence. And it does talk a lot about various sides and kind of what they want and how they influence the general situation in Wales in that period, especially the conflict between Henry and Llywelyn, both the Great and then eventually the last, and Edward I. So that book was actually really helpful in that respect because it had all those perspectives, and I do kind of recommend that one. And like I said, it was one of the ones I leaned on. There are actually a few more, some of which I've already shown you. One I don't actually have a paper copy of, but I actually have one on Llywelyn, which is where I relied on a lot of that writing to sort of understand his kind of viewpoint, because it was a much more sort of strongly Welsh in origin. So I'm just going to look it up here. Right. So the name of the book is Llywelyn ap Griffith, Prince of Wales. It is written by J. Beverly Smith. You will have heard me quote him because he was very influential on a lot of the writings. We talked about Sean Davies. He actually influences a couple of things, including Edward I's Conquest of Wales, which is one of the books I've used of his. And as well, I've used The Welsh War of Independence, written by David Moore. I'm still using that one because he actually talks about Glyndŵr. Another book that I've leaned on quite a little bit and probably will go back to again is Welsh Language, A History, written by Janet Davies. That book has been really good at understanding kind of the origins of a lot of Welsh words, the origins of the language and how it came about and how it converged from Brythonic to Old Welsh and then Middle Welsh and then what we will call Modern Welsh. And we will cover that at some point. And the last little document, last couple of digital documents I wanted to cover is the Acts of the Welsh Rulers from 1120 to 1260 or 1283. That one's by Hugh Price, another academic book. This one is actually just mostly laws and different sort of writings, legal codes and things that were written in the time. So it's source material, but it's not very coordinated in a way that if you're trying to just read from front to back, you're going to understand what's going on. Because he jumps historical periods, because he talks by kingdom, not by necessarily by that. Also, the Wales and the Crusades from 1095 to 1291 by Catherine Hurlock. Again, in that Crusade episode, I used this book quite a lot. The last book I want to bring up is Princess Nest of Wales, Seduction of the English by Carrie Mond, another book by her, and also a very good book, and assisted me as I was trying to write something about her, because I didn't know a whole lot before. So to return to kind of talking about the medieval stuff, another person I'm going to rely a lot on over the next little while is Dan Jones, because he's written a number of books which are very helpful to me. This one is awesome, called The Plantagenets. It talks a lot about Edward and Llewellyn and kind of their conflict, even though it's also about all the other Plantagenets up to the end of the line. And it is really, really interesting. He's really good. Like, if you have an audiobook version, it's even very good. And I'm going to show you one of the ones that I will be using in the future that he wrote, which I actually really like. And it's another one that I've leaned on a little bit. Okay, so now we're kind of in a point where we're going to talk about some of the books that are sort of random stuff that I've used now. The other one I should mention before we go too far is Edward I, A Great and Terrible King, and The Forging of Britain by Mark Morris. This is a really good book. It talks a lot about the early life of Edward, kind of how his upbringing influenced a lot of his mentality at the time, and kind of how it developed his entire pathos and kind of how hard-headed and why he was the way he was. And really, really good book. Highly recommend that if you want to know about Edward I and kind of his... It leans much more on him than it does anybody else, so I highly recommend it for that, if nothing else. Companion for Medieval England from 1066 to 1485. I haven't used this loads. It's an encyclopedia, so if you're looking for just something quick, it can be useful, but Wikipedia can do that too. So that's up to you. It was one that somebody gave me, I think. And it's a nice book, but it's not something I use a whole lot. 1215, The Year of the Magna Carta. This one is great for talking about King John and kind of his situation, especially with Llewellyn the Great, who was his, basically his son-in-law, and kind of the end of his line with the Magna Carta. Really interesting. Worth a read, for sure, if you're interested in that kind of stuff. Another one of these sort of like random books I've found, which are kind of helpful, is the Anglesey, The Concise History by David Pretty. Very thin little book. I think I found this online, just a random University of Wales book. It just has a lot of different stuff on Anglesey, going from the early prehistoric times right up till the modern era. So if you're interested in that, that's great. You don't use a lot of it in the podcast simply because, obviously, it's a very thin book covering a lot of years. So about 2,000 years at minimum of history. So it may not, your mileage may vary. Now, one book I will talk briefly about before going on, simply because, well, a couple of them, I guess. They're more generic rather than specific to Britain in one case, and in the other case, it's basically the Roman invasion of Britain, written by John Petty.
Hey, podcast listeners, I'm Paul Brandis introducing my podcast, Countdown to Dallas. It's a fascinating, in-depth look at the seemingly unconnected events that led to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. It's based on my book of the same title. In that book and in this podcast, I go all the way back to 1939, when Lee Harvey Oswald was born into a troubled and dysfunctional family. I'll follow his transient and often violent teenage years and young adulthood, painting a fuller picture of the man who would later become Kennedy's killer. I also take a look at events unfolding in that era, like Cuba and Vietnam, and I'll unpack the conspiracy theories too, not one of which has ever been conclusively proven. Subscribe to Countdown to Dallas at evergreenpodcasts.com or your favorite listening app October 31st.
Greetings from Evergreen Podcasts. We're rolling out a listener survey, and we want to hear from you. The information in the survey will help us gather statistics and in turn make our shows more appealing to advertisers. I know most people don't like ads, but this is one of the only ways our shows make money and help keep their lights on. We promise it will only take a few minutes, but the impact on our podcasts will be tremendous. As a token of our appreciation, we'll randomly select one lucky participant each month to win an exclusive merchandise package from Evergreen Podcasts. Head to evergreenpodcast.com/listenersurvey to help a show and possibly get some free stuff for doing so. We can't thank you enough for the support. Now back to the show.
I bought this book a number of years ago because of my interest in the actual subject matter. This book is hard to read. It is very, very dry. It's very much an academic's book. And unless you're prepared to put the time in to understand everything, you're going to struggle. And to be honest with you, I've not read it since I first bought it because it was so difficult to get through. So there's that. Now, to go back to a couple of books which were significant for early Welsh history in post-Roman periods. This one actually is the main book I used for probably about 100 episodes, it feels like, but at least 70 episodes. It's called Wales and the Britons, 350 to 1064, so you can understand why. This is written by T.M. Charles Edwards, a professor of history. It is a big old book. Again, very much covers every topic imaginable, from language to money to culture to church history to just everything. And I leaned on this book like crazy in that period, and I wish there was another one like it for this period, because man alive, was it ever useful. And I really, really love it, and I'll be honest with you, I miss him. I need more of him in my life, because his writing is amazing. It's a very easy book to read. I will tell you bluntly, it is super pricey. It was over $100 Canadian. But it is an academic book from the University of Oxford, so it's not for everyone. So if you're looking for a readable book, that's definitely readable. If you're looking for an inexpensive readable book, that's not your guy. I will actually talk about one in a minute. Another one that I've leaned on again, same period, Britain After Rome by Robin Fleming. This is a relatively new book. The Fall and Rise from 400 to 1070. Really good book. Didn't lean on it as much. It talks a lot more about modern archaeology and modern finds and that kind of stuff, and it delves into as much that as actual written documents. So really good book, really interesting, a little bit more affordable. Not gonna lie, it's a Penguin book, which means they're generally more affordable. I think I found this in a local shop instead of Amazon, which, to be fair, most of these books have either come from the University of Wales Press or Amazon. Right. Moving on. Right. So we got a couple of books here that I wanted to mention. And they're different for different reasons. One is Bede, the Ecclesiastical History of the English People. Source book. I've talked a lot about this, so I'm not going to go over it too much. I've done an entire episode on it on the podcast. Critical source material written by a 7th century cleric living in northern England, very much biased in his writings, much like Gildas, so you have to take everything he says with a grain of salt. But very interesting book, very unique, and gives us names, dates, and places for a lot of things, most of which are verifiable. So in that respect, he's very useful, and he gives you a very good understanding of the politics and warfare and kind of the angst of that period of English history with some smatterings of Welsh history mixed in. Specifically, of course, the dealings with Gwynedd and the invasion of northern England by Cadwallader. All right, last book from the early Middle Ages I want to chat about. This book is interesting because I think it does a really good job of kind of refuting some of the stuff that we talk about with Arthur. Again, another book that I've used quite extensively during the Arthur episode, and it's called From Guy Hassel, The Worlds of Arthur, Facts and Fiction of the Dark Ages. And he's not writing this from the perspective of somebody who believes Arthur as a king or wants to believe the legends. He's very much talking about what's going on in that period of time, why some of this may be accurate and why a lot of it isn't. Very interesting guy. Worth a read. It is not a very big book and not very expensive, surprisingly. £11 in Britain and $25 in the United States, probably $35 in Canada. And it's pretty good. And it includes a lot of archaeology, a lot of photos, and drawings and things. So I would highly recommend it if you want to get into the Arthurian period in an academic format, as opposed to sort of like the Legend of Arthur and where to find him type of stuff. This is the Board of Celtic Studies, University of Wales, version of the Chronicles of the Princes, the Penarth version, which is considered the most accurate version of the book, translated by Thomas Jones, and it is an English language version of the Chronicle of the Princes, and I'm mangling this in Welsh, so my apologies already. Brut I Tyuscyn. I used to pronounce this better, and I'm awful now. It's been so long since I've even practiced that name. It is a writings written probably around the 9th century initially that were carried on beyond that, kind of like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. So this book, old book, which I picked up because I couldn't afford a new translation. There are new translations out there. But effectively, this does talk about, on a year-by-year basis, going up past the conquest, the history of Wales, written initially for the kings of Gwynedd, so it will have a Gwynedd perspective on things, for sure, but it is one of the few documents that we have written from a Welsh perspective that chronicles that period of Welsh history. So if you want to know sort of mid to late Middle Ages, this is your book, and it actually starts at a point where historically we know it's talking from present point. So it is a book that's definitely a key book if you want a source material book from Welsh medieval history from before the conquest. One thing I wanted to talk about before we go far away from the post-independence era, let's talk about Gerald of Wales and the journey through Wales and the description of Wales. This is a Penguin Classic book that I have. I got it used. It is $20 Canadian, $17 US, probably lower than that. And that was, I don't know when this was bought, so I couldn't tell you. Good book if you want to read some more source material. Penguin has a lot of source material books for relatively inexpensive, as I said before. So you will want to kind of lean on that a bit if you're writing history books, or you want to be able to write an academic article. You're going to want to know where to find them, and that's a couple of books that you want to lean on for that. Now, let's talk about one other book here, which, again, is a heavily academic book, so keep that in mind. So if you're looking for something kind of an easier read, this is probably not your beast. The Political Power in Medieval Gwynedd, Governance and the Welsh Princes by David Stevenson. Excellent book. I used it quite a lot at points because of how important it was to understanding especially the period of the conquest and just before it, because it's very focused on Llywelyn the Last and Llywelyn the Great. It is not before that because we don't have enough written records to come up with what on earth was going on in Gwynedd at that time. Very good book, very important academic book, but it is and can be a complicated thing to read through. But I do like it. And again, because I had to get it from Britain, because this is actually a University of Wales press, it is pricey if you're not in Britain. So more general books to talk about, and books I've leaned on for different things. One is the Cambridge medieval textbook called Medieval Wales by David Walker. This is a, like I said, textbook, small. I got it used, so it was cheap, but I don't know how expensive it would be because of that, I'll be honest. So that kind of ends the period before where we're at in the current timeline. There are probably a few other books I haven't mentioned that I don't remember, and there are academic documents which I've used because I have a lacking in some areas, and those I don't have a list of here, but there are some I've leaned on for various things. They will be something I will lean on occasionally when I don't have enough source material. And there is a couple of websites that are worth checking out for that. And I might talk about them in a later date. But for now, these are the books. I will specifically actually bring up this one first. The Rise and Fall of Owen Glyndŵr, England, France, and the Welsh Rebellion in the Late Middle Ages. This is written by Gideon Brough, or Brough. I could be saying that wrong. He is really, really interesting. I have relied on him for a lot of this last few 20-ish episodes. His is a very good book, and it's not expensive. Hard copy. I know there's probably a paperback now. Really, really good. I really liked it. I really enjoyed it. Another one, and now this book, I will say, I found when I was in Wales in 2011, and this copy I've had ever since then, and it is Terry Breverton's Owen Glyndŵr, the story of the last Prince of Wales. This is a smaller, very readable book. It includes some source material as well as just general talking about Welsh history, and is a very good book if you sort of want to just quickly read through Owen Glyndŵr's story. It is the other book I refer to a lot. I have other sources that I'm using, but those are the main ones because they give me a lot of information specific. And like I said, Gideon's, Professor Brough's book in particular is very, very in-depth and very, very good. And there are times when I want to go off track on his writings and I'll go look up stuff elsewhere. There's been a couple of websites I've leaned on for that, because there are some websites that talk about different things other than just Owen Glyndŵr stuff. So, and as well, Dan Jones has a couple of books which have been very helpful. So also, this is kind of, again, one of those books that's kind of mandatory if you're starting out. John Davies' History of Wales. This book is in paperback. I've got a big old heavy hardback because I got it used and it was cheaper. But it is a very good book. The current book is up to date. This is an older book, so it's not as up to date on current stuff. But it goes through the entire history of Wales. Big old book, but if you want to know the whole history, it will give you a general background on everything. Now we're going to talk about stuff that is post that I've collected so far. I will say I have one book that I don't have in the collection at the moment, which is out in my car, because I've been reading it while I've been on the road, and it is to do with the rise of the Tudors, and specifically the battle which Henry VII wins, which allows the Tudors to rise to the kingdom. But in the meantime, let's start over here. So, okay, so the other books I want to talk about were post Owen Glyndŵr, because of course we've got to look at stuff that comes afterwards and kind of get knee deep in the woods of that. This is probably going to be the main book I'll start to rely on, which is The History of Wales, Volume 3, Recovery, Reorientation and Reformation, Wales, circa 1415 to 1642 by Glenor Williams. This one is, I think, a follow-up of the old 50s book that I have. It will at least allow me to kind of have a general understanding of what's going on in Wales at the time, something I didn't have till recently, so I'm very happy about that. And it will be the basis of stuff that we're talking about for that. I've also got this book by Dan Jones, Hollow Crown, which is The War of the Roses and the Rise of the Tudors. This is a book which I've actually listened to previously as an audiobook, but I actually have the proper book as well. Really good book. I really enjoyed listening to it, and he is very engaging, so highly recommend that. Also, War of the Roses, England's First Civil War by Trevor Royal. The reason why this is important for y'all, and as we get further towards this, so you understand, it is important because the Tudors are, of course, Welsh in origin. So we're talking about a line to the Welsh king, or Welsh kings, that starts from there and goes into the English kings and the French monarchy and becomes significant during the War of the Roses and is key to bringing down Richard III and creating what we call the Tudor Kingdom. So we're going to talk a lot about that because of how important that is. So the other books that I sort of have that are post that, they're mostly textbooks that I found so far. They're just general understanding books. And this one will be good because it kind of covers a similar period to the other book. This is History of Wales, 1485 to 1660 by Hugh Thomas. Very thin book. Haven't read any of it yet, so I don't know how good or bad it is. I am going to start reading it shortly. And then one that's for later, because I haven't been able to find more between the 17th century and the 19th century. I have History of Wales, 1815 to 1906 by Gareth Evans. I'm going to look for more of these, hopefully soon. These are the kind of books that I want because they give me a general understanding, and I can then branch out from there with other source material, which is key when you're trying to do this stuff. And there's going to be, the source material will explode after the 1800s, and that will become a problem. Because I think at that point we're going to have to branch out into subject matter as opposed to specific. So the goal and the idea being is that we'll turn over from being strictly about a progressive kind of idea of from 0 to 100 kind of history to more topical history, talking about things that have interest and that will range in different ways, because once we get above the period of, say, 1600, there are now numerous sources that branch off many different ways. We're going to talk about things like the settlement of Pennsylvania by Welsh settlers, the establishment of religious movements, in the participation of the Welsh population in founding some of these movements, in driving some of these movements forward, in the way that mining of coal works and has worked. And in order to talk about that, they're very broad subject matters, so you're not going to spend simply half of an episode talking about a little bit about a coal mine in 1832 and then not talk about coal mines again until 1838. I want to be able to just take that subject matter and run with it. So we will kind of maneuver to that probably after the Tudor period and kind of move more into that kind of structure. That's a ways to go. As you all know, we're still in the Owen Glyndwr period. That's at least another 10 episodes away from being finished, I suspect. I don't really know. But either which way, with that being the case, we're still a long way down the road from where we want to be. But don't worry, we're going to get there. And I can't wait for y'all to hear all of this. And I can't wait to look into more of it and have a better opportunity to study even more and to be able to talk more about more modern things. We are going to end this podcast at 2000. I see no reason to go beyond that. Once you go into that, that's current events, not history. And I like to shy away from that. So we will end the podcast at 2000. But by the same token, there's so many different subjects you can talk about. This podcast could go on for quite a while still to come. So don't worry, it's not going to end like tomorrow. It's taken us this long to get to 1405. So with that in mind, I want to thank you all for listening, in this particular case from the patrons, for watching this video, for being a part of this podcast, for contributing to this podcast's success, be it through emails and through various social media platforms, through contacting me via so many different ways, suggesting so many different things, having so many different ideas that you want to put forward, correcting my pronunciation, which I don't always get right, obviously, or hardly ever, and being a part of this, because I think this has been something of a surprise to me at how it has grown, and largely with only a mild amount of effort on my part to try and make it grow initially. And so I want to thank you guys for sharing this podcast with your friends, with your family, with strangers, and making it so much bigger than it was. And without you guys, I wouldn't have this massive mound of books that I have to read to understand and do all of this work. And realistically, I am so grateful for that, and I'm so grateful for all of you. And especially, I want to say a specific thanks to my patrons who have been investing in this podcast, because it is an investment. And I can tell you that I have very much appreciated it. but I'm overwhelmed, really, by all of the generosity that you've all given me, and thank you very much. And with that, I want to end the podcast for today. Thank you for listening. You can find everything we do at distractionsmedia.com. You can find me on Twitter at Welsh History Pod, or on Facebook at facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast, or on any number of things under the name Linstead DM, on Twitter, on Twitch, on Instagram, and many other places. And be sure to check those things out as well, as that's not always talking about Welsh history. It goes on into a lot of other things, and I'm more conversant on that simply because I have more to talk about on that. But thank you guys. Appreciate your help. Appreciate your love and support. And thank you once again. Goodbye.
This has been a Distractions Media production, and for everything we do, check out distractionsmedia.com.
Whether it's missing flights or retirements out of the blue, whether it's resignations or bans, as the old saying goes, there's never a quiet day in West Indies cricket. So make sure you listen to West Indies on 99.94 to stay up to date with all the latest fallout with the teams in maroon.